Hello, and welcome to Privacy News Today, presented to you by Termageddon.com. So, today we're going to talk about Norway's Data Protection Authority and the fact that they issued guidance for website analytics and tracking so that website owners can make sure that analytics and tracking is compliant with GDPR. Please note that the following information is not legal advice. So what happened here is that Norway's Data Protection Authority said that there are many analytics and tracking tools on the market today, and many of those tools are being used by websites. But that does not necessarily mean that those tools are actually compliant. Since you're the one that's responsible for making sure that your website is compliant, the DPA issued a list of advice for companies for the use of analytics and tracking tools on websites. So during today's privacy segment, we'll go through that list of advice and explain what that advice actually means. So the first tip is to comply with GDPR. So if GDPR, European Union's privacy law, applies to you, you need to make sure that any analytics and tracking tools that you use are compliant with that privacy law. And that's because those tools collect personal data. So IP addresses, cookie IDs, location data, and information about users' devices that is commonly collected by those tools is considered personal data and is therefore covered under GDPR. The second tip is to minimize data collection. So GDPR says that you cannot collect more data than what you actually need. So if you are using an analytics tool on your website that is collecting personal data and you're not actually using that data, then you're in violation of GDPR. So for example, if your website uses Google Analytics and you've never actually logged into Google Analytics to see that data or never actually done anything with that data, you should stop using that tool. In addition, personal data cannot be stored longer than needed. So if you have used the data that is being collected by that tool and no longer need it anymore, you should delete that data. Tip number 3 is to not rely completely on a cookie consent banner. So even if you have a cookie consent banner, you must still have a legal basis for collecting that data. And that legal basis should be cited in your privacy policy. One of the legal bases that is most commonly used for tracking tools and analytics is consent. So if you base cookie collection on consent, then that consent must actually be valid. This means that user must take an actual affirmative step to provide their consent to the collection of their data, meaning that your cookie consent banner must have an accept and a decline option, and that functional and marketing cookies should not be applied on the user's device until they have actually consented to doing so. In addition, after a user has consented to their information being collected or to the cookies being placed on their device, they must be able to withdraw their consent at any time. Tip 4, prevent others from using personal data from your website. So there are certain analytics and tracking tools that will only process personal data on your behalf, while other tools reserve the right to use it themselves for their own purposes. This information is usually in their terms of service, privacy policy, or data processing agreement. You should make sure to read those policies of any tools that you intend to use to make sure that they only process data on your behalf and will not use that data themselves for their own purposes. Tip 5, some websites require more caution than others. So websites that are collecting especially sensitive data like health, orientation, sexual relations, religion, ethnicity, and other information require special protection. And the DPA says specifically that websites that collect this data should avoid analytics and tracking tools altogether because it's very easy to violate the protections afforded for that sensitive special data. So it's best to just avoid these types of tools altogether if this is the type of data that you are collecting. Tip 6, avoid personal data flowing to unsafe countries. So not all countries offer sufficient privacy protections for residents of the European Union. This especially applies to countries that do not have privacy laws or do not have protections for residents of the EU. So you should make sure to check the privacy policy or terms of service of the tools that you're using to determine where data may be transferred and how. So is it transferred to a country that has been deemed by the European Union as safe or not? And also what kind of protections are being offered for that data to make sure that residents of the European Union have the same protections when that data is transferred as if that data was in the EU. Tip 7, be open. So in your privacy policy and or your cookie policy, you should provide information as to how you process the personal data that you collect. So whether or not you'll be using that data for analytics, advertising purposes, targeted ads, things like that. And this is actually kind of interesting because a lot of the new US privacy laws state that consumers need to know whether their data will be used for targeted ads. So it seems like it's the same way in GDPR as well. So you need to provide consumers with information as to how you will actually process their personal data. Tip 8, respect the visitor's rights. So in your privacy policy, you should inform website visitors of their privacy rights. So for example, whether they have a right to ask for the deletion or the correction of their personal data, things like that. And you must also process requests within 1 month. In addition, if you are using a cookie consent banner and a user has clicked decline, meaning that they do not want these cookies being placed on their device, that's a right that they have, and you do need to respect that. So if they do click decline, you should not apply those cookies to their device. Tip 9, read up and ask for help. So make sure that you read up on additional obligations, such as how you can use personal data. All of that is laid out in GDPR. It's also laid out in Data Protection Authority guidance as well. And finally, the DPA says if you do have any questions, you can reach out to them for clarification on certain practices. So those are the 9 tips that the Norway's DPA is suggesting whenever you're considering using analytics or tracking tools on your website.